And we are live. Well, I want to welcome everybody who is anxiously awaiting this amazing live stream. I am joined today by who might be a nemesis of mine. I don't know yet. I don't know yet because this one person is trying to redefine the way we measure mountains.
Uh-oh.
Sort of. Guys, I want to welcome to our channel somebody who it's just such an honor to finally get to meet him. This is Greg Slayton. He is the founder and webmaster of Peakbagger.com. Now, listen, guys, I'm not sponsored by Peakbagger. This video is not sponsored by Peakbagger, but I use Peakbagger in 80% of the videos I make. 80% of the videos that we make for the channel, well, they're about the mountains. And this is by far the best website, the best app out there when it comes to stating facts about mountains. And of course, if you're making a lot of videos in the mountains, you need a lot of facts about the mountains. And what you'll find, and you guys have heard me talk about this on the channel a lot, is that when you go from one website to another website, this fact-oriented, supposedly authoritative source, it'll differ from another authoritative source. It's weird. About something like mountain elevation or whatever. I find that Peakbagger is consistent, so I use their information, their facts all the time, but they're a lot more than that. It's a free website, in case you're wondering what I'm talking about. It's a free website, and it's an app that provides information about mountains, including peak heights, locations, climbing activity. It's a resource for hikers, climbers, and mountaineers who enjoy reaching summits. Peakbagger.com has a large database and mountain peaks, ranges, and the list goes on and on. Users can customize their peak lists and add their preferences, and registered users, and I find this very helpful. Registered users can write reports about their climbing trips. And I love that because I can go back in and look at what they've written and make a determination whether I want to tackle that particular hike that day or that month or whatever. Peakbagger.com has topographical maps. Listen, topographical maps are expensive. And the fact that you can go to peakbagger.com and use their map, that's just amazing. And they have them for just about anywhere in the world that you want to be hiking or mountaineering, climbing. And that includes protected land areas. So they also have weather. Users can view weather forecasts for peaks in the U.S. and other parts of the world. I haven't used this particular feature as much as I probably should have in the past. You can also import and display GPS tracks and waypoints. And offline users can save peaks and topographic maps to their device for offline use. So, guys, I want to welcome to you today, Greg Slayton, to the channel. And this is the first time that we've met. It was just earlier, about 30 minutes of prep beforehand. But I'm telling you, this guy's amazing. It's an honor to meet you, Greg.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
I told Greg, I said, the crowd that watches our videos, we are a special crowd. We are a band of brothers. But I also shared with him the fact that there's a little bit of a rivalry, maybe if you want to call it that, between people that just don't understand why measuring mountain prominence is, why it's a thing. Like, why don't we just use the elevation of a mountain? I mean, that's what we were taught in school. Like, if you're taught Mount Mitchell is the highest mountain in the Appalachian Mountains, why isn't that good enough? Why is it that when I talk about Mount Mitchell being the highest mountain east of the Mississippi, inevitably someone from New Hampshire or someone from the Northeast in general will chime in and they'll say, yeah, but Mount Washington has the highest prominence. And I'm like, why do I care? Well, Greg's going to explain some reasons. He's been doing this a long time. He's going to explain some of the reasons why mountain prominence is a big deal to a lot of people and why measuring mountain prominence is important. What does it mean to measure mountains by their prominence?
Right.
You're going to hit all kinds of stuff like this. So, Greg, I'll let you begin and just talk about this. What exactly is mountain prominence, and why is it an important measurement in geography or mountaineering?
Well, sure. I can. It's one of those concepts that is kind of simple, but kind of hard to explain at the same time. The best way I find to introduce it is a lot of people are used to a list, say, of the highest mountains in a certain place, like the highest mountains in North Carolina or the highest mountains in New Hampshire or whatever. And you quickly run into a problem when you're compiling this list. You know what the highest is, and then you say, oh, and here's the second highest one. But at a certain point, you get to this point where you're saying, what counts as a peak? In other words, is every little rock on the ridge a separate peak? Is every little hump, every little bump, is that a peak? And so you find yourself, when you're creating this elevation-based list, you have to have a cutoff of like, oh, the peak has to rise a certain amount before it can be considered a real peak. So in general, like in the Appalachians, I think it's about a 200-foot rule tends to be there, which says that a peak has to rise 200 feet above its connecting saddle or gap with the next peak, and then it's a real peak, and then it goes on the list. So that's a pretty standard way. But the interesting thing is that 200 feet, that's the prominence cutoff, actually. So a peak that is rising, if you're on Mount Mitchell, like say, and you hike north towards Mount Craig, and there's a low point in the ridge, that low point is the prominence saddle for Mount Craig. And Mount Craig rises maybe a couple hundred feet above that, and that's the prominence of Mount Craig. And so that's all well and fine. So actually, prominence is already used for elevation lists. Does that make sense, Bill?
Yeah, it makes sense, especially if you're saying, okay, we're going to define a peak by this standard. Mm-hmm. So prominence is only saying, look, this is how we officially define a peak. But let me tell you what a lot of people will say. I made a video a few years ago, and the name of the video is Mount Eagle. It's a mountain down here in Chattanooga, or maybe it's not, but is Mount Eagle really a mountain? Because, okay, technically it's a plateau and it's not a mountain. Okay. Sure. Or if I'm talking about the Alleghenies, every now and then somebody will chime in, but those are not mountains, those are plateaus, which is sort of an eye roll, because you want to go, okay, we know. But if you're hiking, why does that matter if you're hiking? And what does it mean if it's called a mountain? It's Mount such and such. And the people around the town and around the locals there, they're like, yeah, that's mountain. You can get to the summit.
Sure. The word mountain is really kind of, or hill or bump or plateau, it's all just terms. But when you start looking at it analytically, you say people want to know purely objectively, not what people call it or not what the language says it is. They want to know, is this peak a mountain or not? Is this peak? And really, prominence is the best way to define that. And the formal definition of prominence is the amount of peak rises above its connecting saddle with a higher peak. So for any peak in the world, almost, you can follow a ridge to a higher peak. And then if you just find the lowest point on that little walk you did, and then measure from that up to the top of the peak, then that's the prominence. So it's a very simple measurement, really. And that tells you objectively, without any regard to what the locals at the foot of the hill call it, or what it says on the map, or what the list makers decide. That number for the peak is objective, fact-based, and can't be changed. The prominence. So that's why a lot of people are really kind of into it. They're like, oh wow, here's a measure that tells me how big or important a mountain is, without resorting to any sort of arbitrariness.
Sure. But Greg, because it sounds almost though like it's marketing. Now hear me out on this. Hear me out. So you've got New Hampshire, okay? Yeah. New Hampshire claims to have the most 4,000-foot peaks east of the Mississippi. That's what they claim. And they've got a website. And listen, by the way, if you're from New Hampshire, I love New Hampshire. I'm a huge New England.
I do too. I grew up hiking there. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. I think Carolyn and I, we can't wait to go back. We just got back here. Back from New England this past in October. In fact, check out that playlist, guys, if you're watching. Great playlist. But anyway, they will claim that they have the most 4,000-foot peaks of anybody else east of the Mississippi. But the average elevation in West Virginia, is I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's 1,500 feet or something like that. I can't remember, and they have I think over 100 4,000-foot mountains. How is it fair? Okay, by the definition you're giving, I can definitely see how New Hampshire would make that claim. But it takes away from the fact of the amazing mountains that are in West Virginia. I mean, if I'm from West Virginia, I'm going to cry foul. It almost sounds like what is it called? The Appalachian Mountain Club. They've been around since 1857. 1876. Yeah. 1876. All right. So they've been around a long time. Great group, by the way. And of course, I'm just picking here, but it's almost like it's been marketed in a certain way. But it's a little misleading, though, if you're looking for a state with the most, I don't know, but most mountains, you would think it would just automatically be West Virginia as far as east of the Mississippi. But because of mountain prominence, it almost gives, if we're talking about the tourist industry, it almost gives New Hampshire this edge. And if you've ever been to West Virginia, man, it's all mountain. The whole state's just one mountain after another. What is your comeback to the critics who say New Hampshire is cheating?
Well, the actual topography on the ground can't be changed. There are certain things, and prominence, as I said, it's purely mathematical. So by saying that, if the people in New Hampshire say there are more peaks with 2,000 feet of prominence in New Hampshire than West Virginia, that's a fact. That's like saying 2 + 2 = 4. Now, that's not saying anything that the mountains in West Virginia aren't beautiful or have better forests or have better infrastructure or have nicer trails or are more scenic or go on forever or whatever. The average elevation of the state. I mean, the average elevation of a state, that is a fact too. You can actually objectively measure that. So, and sure, whenever you market something, you always glom onto the fact that helps you the best, of
right.
course. So,
so maybe they are doing that a little, but it's factual.
But prominence, as I said, a lot of the researchers on it are mathematicians, and they look at things in a very objective numerical way. And so now their results don't always match with expectations. There's a similar rivalry out west where the people in Colorado are very proud of all their 14,000 foot peaks, and rightly so. They definitely have the most. And and bear in mind too that the definition of a peak is fundamentally arbitrary, because you have to come up with some sort of a prominence cutoff to decide what a peak is. But in Washington state, most of the peaks outside of the volcanoes are only about 8,000 feet high. So the Coloradans, they look at the Washington people saying, "Oh, your peaks are like half the height of ours. You guys are lame." But in Washington, because our valleys are deeper between the peaks, we have a lot more prominent peaks in Colorado. We have 144 2,000 foot prominence peaks, and Colorado only has about 70. So, and we say, "Oh yeah, well our peaks are better because they're more prominent." Again, it's all marketing. It's all good-natured fun, but it's just another way to look at things. I mean, if you love mountains and you're looking for ones to climb,
sure.
There are many ways you can do it. You can do it by elevation. You can do it by prominence. You can do it by the best trails. You can do it by the best views. There are all different ways to do it. Just prominence, I think, appeals to sort of the engineers, the mathematicians, and it say, hey, if I climb the most prominent mountains, it generally lines up pretty well with the mountains that are the highest and most prominent and most commanding, and that works out pretty well.
But what if I want to say my mountains are bigger than your mountains because they are so many feet above sea level? Shouldn't that matter? I mean, let's just face it, the Black Mountains, largest average elevation of a sub-range in the Appalachians. Doesn't that matter? Doesn't that mean something, Greg? Come on, man. Help.
It does. It does. I mean, if you want to use prominence as a metric to define what a peak is, which is like, say, if it has to have 200 feet of prominence to be a peak. Otherwise, it's just a boulder on a ridge, So if you use that metric, I haven't run the stats on that, but perhaps North Carolina or the South would come out better than New England on that. But, it all depends on what arbitrary cutoff you pick, and then you can get whatever result you want,
So you're kind of saying it's whatever floats your boat.
That's true for hiking. The best climbers are the ones having the most fun. The best hikers are the ones having the most fun.
What a great saying! I need to write that down. The best hikers are the ones having the most fun. I love it.
And I think a lot of people who call themselves peakbaggers are focused on different kinds of lists, and they're all different kinds of lists. And I know some people that all they want to do is high points. They want to do high points of states, high points of countries, high points of counties, high points of national parks, whatever. And if something's not a high point, they just don't want to do it. That's fine. They're having fun. They have their goals. Some people, they want to do all the highest peaks in their home state, or all the highest peaks in another state, or all the ones above a certain threshold, like the South Beyond 6,000 list, for example, that has all the highest peaks in the South. That's a great
The
list.
Southern Sixers, yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
That's my
exactly.
list. That's the one I'm working on.
That's a great list. The first list I did was the New Hampshire 4,000 footers. Again, a fun list. It's great.
The 48, you've done the 48 peaks or whatever it is. Is it 48?
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah. So, yeah, there are all kinds of fun lists. And, I think that one problem is that, and this is where prominence might help, if you're doing a list for the whole US, say, for example, you can't really pick an elevation threshold because a 14,000 foot peak in Colorado is roughly similar to a 6,000 foot peak in the South, as terms of the elevation you gain and just how many there are and all that kind of stuff, So how do you make a list for the whole US that takes that into account?
Okay.
Well, this is where prominence is nice because, for example, there's a list of the 57 peaks with over 5,000 feet of prominence in the US. And that's kind of a nice list because it's using a universal single criterion for all the states. And, there's a peak in New Hampshire, there's a peak in North Carolina, there's 3 in Colorado, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's a pretty good list for someone who mathematically wants to have a single criterion and wants to climb all over the country,
So a standard, if you will. Now, you were talking about this earlier, right before we signed on. You were talking about how Peakbagger, it's a slur. Can you talk about that? Like, it's almost an insult amongst that community.
Oh, sure, of course. If you read the serious climbing literature, like the American Alpine Club journals and stuff like that, the best climbers and the sponsored athletes in the world now who are the top of their game, they don't really care about getting to the top of mountains anymore. They want to climb the hardest routes because pretty much every mountain has already been climbed. And the easiest route is not exciting anymore because that's the way everybody goes. And it was done a long time ago. So, the upper echelons of the sport are these incredible athletes who do single push first ascents in Yosemite National Park and El Capitan, or they go to the Himalaya and climb the north face of Nanga Parbat in record time and all this crazy stuff. And a lot of times they just turn around before they even get to the summit because they finish their route. They're all done. They go back down and they get written up in the climbing magazines and they have awesome photographs to show of their ascent. And they see someone, if they're climbing up the hard new route on a major peak and they see some tourist climbing up the backside on the easy trail, they say, oh, he's just a peak bagger, he just wants to bag the peak, and we are doing the real climbing, and
okay.
So, but as a peak bagger, I'm part of the reason I chose that name for the site is I want to reclaim that word as something positive because, as I said, not everybody can do these incredibly difficult first ascents of new routes, but a lot of people can hike, they can bike, they can drive their cars up to certain peaks in the Appalachians, they can scramble, they can ski, they can snowshoe, whatever. They're all different ways to get outdoors. And I find peak bagging is a great way to add structure to my outdoor adventures. I'm like, oh, here's a list of peaks. I'll try to get up all of those, and some peaks will be easier than others. Some will be this way. But in general, for the most part, I think most of us try to find the easiest way up because a lot of these peaks are hard, if you especially have a significant list. And each one offers a new experience, new interesting things about it. And it's fun. And as I said, we're having fun. And the serious alpinists are having their fun too. And there's nothing wrong with that.
We've made over 100 videos on the Blue Ridge Parkway, the different stuff about the Blue Ridge Parkway and on and on. My wife and I it's our favorite place in the world, 469 miles, of just absolute beauty. What Peakbagger.com has helped me with is understanding, first of all, mountain subranges. Just understanding where one range ends and another one begins, like finding those locations. Okay, because some of that they're just lines on a map. They don't have any, but there are occasions where that kind of does matter. But there's another reason as well, and that's to understand how significant. Because a lot of times I hear people say this when we'll take them on the Parkway for a drive, or up there in Shenandoah National Park on Skyline Drive, same thing, where they almost have the attitude of, if you've seen one mountain, you've seen them all. And I want to go, oh no, that's not the case. And
No.
sometimes with your website, it makes it a lot easier to be able to explain why one mountain is just a lot different than the other. And there at Mount Washington, you've got Jefferson and you've got Mount Adams. You got these other mountains there, and just to be able to explain the different aspects of each of the mountains and why this one would be a monster to climb versus this other one, why that would be a monster to climb.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it a lot of fun, because you're able to explain to somebody else who may not, maybe they're interested, or maybe they haven't done that hike. I know a buddy of mine, he's got a YouTube channel. He's the Kilted Adventurer, and he hikes in mountains as well. But if we're talking about mountains, we'll instead of just going by elevation, a lot of times we'll either go to prominence or something else to be able to explain why one hike is a difficult hike compared to the other ones. They're in by Mount Geo. They're in the Appalachians. But I'm trying to think. It's outside Knoxville there. No, it's outside. Well, I'm drawing a blank. It's on the other side of North Carolina. But anyway, there's this whole area there where it's not, the prominence there isn't that significant. These are all, they're 6,000 foot peaks, like one after another one, all in that area.
Yeah.
But once you get up in your elevation, once you get up 2,000, from the bottom up to about 5,000 to 6,000 feet, it's just, at that point, you're almost walking hills through certain areas. It doesn't mean it's easy, but I'm just saying it's not the same as, let's say, I don't know, climbing Pikes Peak.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, Pikes Peak, by the way, has a road to the top. So that's really easy if you want to climb that.
So are you biased when it comes to like Mount Mitchell or Mount Washington, for example? Are you biased towards, mountains like that where there are roads that lead to the top,
No, because the peaks I like to climb, there are plenty of them that are hard. Some of them are really, really hard. I mean, I've started, I've been on climbs in places like Alaska and the Alps and stuff that are really hard climbs. So any peak that has a road to the top, I'm like, great. I mean, that's one that's a little bit easy. Yes. And, that's a clear minority. Very few peaks have roads to the top, like Mount Washington and Mount Mitchell. But But when they have them, I will admit I have hiked up Mount Washington because I did a lot of hiking around there and I wanted to experience all the trails, but I haven't spent that much time in the South. And so I just drove up Mount Mitchell and called it good and say, okay, and that's part of sort of the general rules of peakbagging for the most part is, no matter how you get to the top, it counts. I think the only thing people don't allow is helicopters. That's considered cheating, but pretty much anything else is fair game.
Anything else is fair game. That kind of makes sense. I don't know. There are certain places where I've daydreamed or prayed that a helicopter would take me to the location and pick me up.
That's true.
And there's in Sharp Top Mountain in Virginia has some insane prominence right there. I mean, Jefferson at one point, Thomas Jefferson owned the land there all the way from a different, I guess, about 50 miles north from Monticello down to Sharp Top. He owned all this land, and he went down there and he was convinced it was the largest mountain in North America. He was convinced of it.
I heard that the first person to climb Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina thought it was the highest peak in the Americas too.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. There are some places there. And again, from one region to the next, when you tell somebody that this area these mountains are higher than, let's say, the mountains that they grew up with, it's almost fighting words. I mean, it's like, what do you mean? I was told the elevation was this. You're like, yeah, but the prominence here, or vice versa. Like the elevation of these mountains, it's more significant. These people get really.
You can tell people that elevation only tells you one thing about a mountain, and that is how thin the air is. That's it. That's the only thing it tells you, because a 6,000 foot peak in the Southern Appalachians versus a 6,000 peak in Greenland versus a 6,000 peak in the Himalaya, they're all totally different mountains, radically different. I mean, the elevation, the conditions you're going to get on the mountain and all that is going to depend on the climate and all of that. The good thing about prominence is that tells you, the main thing prominence tells you about a mountain is how far away you are from other higher mountains. In other words, how isolated you are. When you're on top of a prominent peak, the prominence generally correlates with how far you can see and how high you feel above everything else. So that's why a lot of people like prominence. So, that's why I think a lot of the state high points just happen to be the most prominent peaks, because that's just sort of a byproduct of the measurement. It will reward peaks that are, and it's mathematically objective. So prominence I personally find that lists based on prominence generally provide you with a greater variety of peaks, and they're all really nice peaks when you're on top.
I will say this, that when you call something a peak based on prominence, in other words, they've made the list, so to speak.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, especially high prominence peaks,
they're famous usually. They're
yeah,
famous.
Yeah. I mean, there are a few cases where a high prominence peak is not particularly famous, and it does happen, but it's rare. Whenever you make a list of the most prominent peaks in a range or a state or a country, people say, "Oh yeah, I've heard of that. I've heard of that. I've heard of that." That's just
Sure.
sort of what the measurement is trying to capture in some ways, is the
You
overall.
mentioned the Southern Sixers earlier, and a lot of the mountains on that list are nobody's ever heard of them.
Yeah, they're just basically they're I understand there's some bushwhacking involved, and you bushwhack for a while through the forest and say, okay, here I am. You take a picture and you're all done, and
It's not that impressive when you get to the top. I mean, the scenery, when you occasionally get scenery, because there's no, it's not like it's cleared or anything. It's as, some people would argue it's a rainforest, that it's thick and it's very thick. So
yes,
it's not necessarily a rewarding hike, but the ones that are, let's take the ones in the Southern Appalachians that are kind of recognized as having some prominence. They've got some great scenery, because when you get to the top and you've got a beautiful view, you're surrounded by mountains and not just a grand valley below.
yes,
And
exactly.
I would say that in New Hampshire, that one of the things that I noticed is most of their mountains are kind of collections of islands across the area. Would you agree with that? Or in Maine, especially?
Well, yeah, because in the northern Appalachians, or as I say up there, the Appalachians.
Those are fighting words.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
In the northern areas, the climate is such that the highest peaks are above the tree line, and so the areas of tree line are kind of like islands. So you have the Presidentials are like an island, and then the Franconia Range from Mount Lafayette is another island, and there are a few other peaks that arise above the trees. So yes, and that is one of the appeals of hiking in New England, is being able to climb above the trees and be above it all. And that's something, if you go hiking in, say, Colorado or someplace like that, you're above tree line all the time. There's
Sure.
huge areas above tree line. So the northern Appalachians are the place where you can sort of experience a little bit of that in these small areas that are high above the trees.
Sure. And I guess I'll say it this way. The fact that you said Appalachians, that may have hurt your credibility among some of our Southern viewers. One of the biggest debates, of course I'm playing, but one of our biggest debates on our channel is how to say Appalachian. And I had said Appalachian, that's the way I pronounced it, Appalachian, for many years, because, that's just the way I grew up pronouncing it. The community that surrounded me, that's the way they pronounced it. And we were from a particular region in Eastern Kentucky. That's the way a lot of the people in that area pronounces it. When I put it on a video, there was outrage when I said Appalachian. So I even made an apology video saying, look, I don't know why I was pronouncing it wrong. I thought maybe I was just crazy. But over the years, when you start talking about it, you realize there's like 5 different ways
absolutely
pronounced regionally. And sometimes I think when it comes to going back to elevation versus prominence, sometimes I think what people misunderstand is that just because a mountain may be more prominent or the elevation is higher, doesn't necessarily, the word significance there is subjective. It's not mathematical. It's subjective. When we say something is more significant, or this is more significant, that would be a subjective statement. So just because it's not your favorite mountain doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a whole lot of other people's favorite mountain. And so
exactly.
what I tell my friends here, and when I'm making videos about New England mountains, I'm like, look, if you love the Blue Ridge Parkway, if you love driving on the Blue Ridge Parkway and you love those mountains, why don't you just take the extra day and go to New Hampshire and go to what is it called? Smuggler's Notch up in Vermont. Gorgeous. I mean, all those, or J Peak. Those are gorgeous mountains. And I'm sure you can name a dozen more that are just absolutely beautiful. That kind of blow your mind. They're in the Appalachian chain, but they're absolutely gorgeous. What's your opinion about the Appalachian Mountains in general? That they're not really one mountain range. You know, they're really a bunch of smaller.
Well, sure. I mean, I think it's I'm not a geologist, but my understanding is they're an ancient mountain range that was as high as the Rockies were at one point.
Sure.
The erosion has worn them down, and the plates have shifted and twisted them around, and now they're just the ancient bones of what was formerly a huge mountain range. But I grew up in the northern Appalachians, and it's always been my home range, and I have a great fondness for it. I've since climbed all over the world, but and every mountain range is different. And every mountain is different, and they're all beautiful, each in their own ways. The mountains with the desert, the mountains in the rainforest, the mountains with glaciers on them. The Appalachians are, of course, not well regarded in the world climbing community. Of course, if you're a serious climber, you don't spend any time there. There's some really good rock climbing in certain places, and a lot of challenging rock faces. But as far as summits that require any sort of climbing or effort to get to, there just aren't any, unfortunately. So a lot of serious climbers, don't spend a lot of time here. But I think they're missing out. I mean, I've as I said, I've always enjoyed my travels in the eastern U.S. and they have the forests and the above tree line areas. When people in Colorado say, "Oh, well, our whole state's above tree line," we get views and everything all the time. I'm like, well, that means you're not really appreciating it. If you're hiking in New Hampshire, very few peaks have tree line, and so there's kind of a Zen thing where you appreciate the small amount of open terrain that you have and the views that it provides, rather than just getting kind of blasé about, oh yeah, that happens all the time. So
they say that New Hampshire is the birthplace of mountaineering. And so you being from that area, that has to, it must be in your bones too.
Well, I wouldn't call it the birthplace of mountaineering. That's kind of I think that in terms of actual climbing and in terms of what you might call mountain climbing, that really started in the Alps, because they have real mountains to climb there, I think. But yeah, a lot of people who started out hiking in New Hampshire did. It provides a lot of good training. The trails there are very rugged and very steep. And I was mentioning this earlier, how some of those trails aren't really trails in the normal sense of the word. It's actually kind of scrambling, really, almost, which is by definition off-trail travel over rocky terrain where you're trying to reach a summit. But a lot of the trails there are good preparation for if you ever do start going out west to places in the Rockies. The trails and in the Adirondacks, which are not part of the Appalachians, of course, but the Adirondacks in the mountains of New England have very rough trails. They go straight up, and they're okay. How am I supposed to get up this rock cliff here in the middle of the trail? And that's good preparation for actually the scrambling, and then that can lead to more real mountaineering. And so, a lot of famous climbers they got their start there.
So, what I read was that if you're wanting to learn to climb or climb Everest one day, a lot of people train in the White Mountains. Is that true?
Yeah, especially in the winter.
Wow.
If you want to climb, say, Denali or Mount Everest, and you want to be prepared for the cold weather, trying to do a presidential traverse in January, that's good preparation for it as far as the wind and the cold and the snow and the terrain and everything. It's one of the coldest places in the world. It's relatively accessible.
It looks so cold. And when having done these videos for years and years and years now, I think 7 or 8 years we've been doing these videos, and you go to West Virginia, they get a lot of snow in West Virginia. It gets cold there. It's on the Allegheny front. It was sort of shocking to me to realize how much of a difference West Virginia is to even Virginia as far as weather is concerned. but you guys have a whole new level, a whole new understanding of cold weather.
Well, you can always get recalibrated on that. I climbed Denali a few years back, and
oh wow,
in my younger day, and that was just a whole level of cold. 40 below zero kind of stuff. For days on end, and I don't want to go back there. Let me tell you.
So you champion Denali. Wow, that is impressive. I didn't know that. That's really cool. Like, I think you slipped it in early, but I didn't catch it until just then. Are there any other famous peaks like that you've climbed?
Well, I was I actually after doing the 48 4,000 footers in New Hampshire, my next goal was the state high points.
Okay.
So that's kind of a kind of list that a lot of people like to pursue, is the various high points of the various states. And that's an easy list to do when you start on the East Coast, because you can do 5 in a day, because a lot of them are really short hikes or drive ups. You can do you can do the short hike up Mount Rogers, then drive down to Mount Mitchell in North Carolina, then drive down to Sassafras Knob in South Carolina. You can just rack them up.
Sure.
So I got started there, and then they started getting a bit harder once you get west. And after I'd done the 48, I'm like, okay, I've got like this hard one to do. Okay, and I had I was young, I had the momentum, and so that seemed like a nice thing to try to do. But yeah, it all depends. Again, as I said, a good peak bagging list is one that has a variety of peaks on it. Some that are easy, some that are medium, some that are hard. And it takes you to all kinds of places you'd never imagine you would be.
Oh, yes, indeed. Where have you had what is the most scariest? What would be the scariest encounter that you've ever had? On a hiking trip like this, on some crazy peak. What's the scariest moment you've had?
Oh gosh, it's so hard to say. I think I climbed this one peak in the Alps where I was really scared. I kept turning back because the weather wasn't good and it looked too steep for me, but I kept meeting these people who would say, "Oh yeah, you can come with us." And I said, "Oh great!" So I had some people to hike with, but then they would turn back, and so I'd consider if I wanted to turn back. And finally, we were able to scramble across this ridge, and it was a knife edge ridge, and we're scrambling very carefully across it, and it was a whiteout, complete fog. And we got to the top, and we were really impressed. And then all of a sudden, the fog lifted. And then I could see that on either side of this knife edge ridge, it was like dropping down like 4,000 feet. And I'm like, if it hadn't been for that fog, I probably wouldn't have climbed it, because I couldn't see how far it was to down. And then we had to make our way back, knowing full well what the exposure was. And that was even scarier. So,
That had to be scary. What is the highest peak in Florida? Is it Space Mountain? Is that,
Yeah, it probably is actually. I think actually the highest point is the launch, the rocket towers at Cape Canaveral.
Yeah.
That's probably the highest point in Florida. But actually, for state high pointers and for peak baggers in general, we only count highest natural peaks.
Sure.
So we don't count buildings. We don't count landfills. Things like that. Because I think there was some place where a landfill was the highest point. That didn't count. But yeah, there is a little hill up by the Florida Panhandle up near the Alabama border. It's the highest point in Florida, 345 feet above sea.
You're kidding me. They actually have a highest point. That's outstanding. And the fact that
there's a little park there. There's a little park. They have like on the side of the road, there's a monument. You can drive up there and take your picture, and boom,
wow.
You've got another state high point. Absolutely.
That is really cool. I didn't know that. So, okay, then let me ask you this then. Of all the states that you've tackled this, what would be the most, I guess, shocking, I would say? Like, hey, this state may not be known for high peaks, but this was really cool. What's a unique experience?
There are a lot of state high points on the high plains, like on the western side of North Dakota or Kansas or Nebraska or Oklahoma. And I found those to be beautiful, actually, because a lot of people drive across the U.S. on the interstate highways and they get bored driving through Kansas. They fall asleep or whatever. But I found that once you get off the interstate and start driving the farm roads and you get to these remote high points, you're just out there in the plains. It's wide open and the wind is blowing. It's just, I don't know. I found that to be an interesting landscape that was more it wasn't spectacular in your face, jagged peaks or anything, but it was just, I found it was very sort of peaceful, open landscape, and it affected me more than I thought.
Wow. One of the interesting things you talked about, elevation, and last summer I was in Kenya, and I didn't realize we were driving out of Nairobi to Lake Nakuru.
Yes.
And while we were driving, my ears kept popping.
Oh, sure.
I didn't know, like, you could see some mountains in the distance there. I knew the overall elevation was high the whole time we were there, but as we were driving to Lake Nakuru, my ears started popping like, wow, I feel like we're flying. And I looked, and I think we were at like 9,000 foot of elevation, but you wouldn't know it by the terrain around you. That's another reason why elevation is not the only tool.
Oh, sure. I flew into the airport in La Paz, Bolivia, and that city's at 13,000 feet.
Yeah.
And they have oxygen and EMTs at the airport, because a lot of people, because normally when your plane lands, when you're flying, they reduce the amount of oxygen in the cabin to sort of save on money and stuff. But when it starts to land, they increase the oxygen, so it's back to sea level by the time they land. But when you land in Bolivia, they actually have to decrease the oxygen so it'll match where it lands. And so, a lot of people, if you have a health condition or something, you could be in big trouble when you get off the plane there, and you're higher up than, a lot of mountains all over the world. So that again tells you why elevation is, especially on like a list that has a worldwide scope, is not really a very good measure.
If you were to give somebody that's wanting to get into hiking, get into mountaineering in general, what would you recommend? Where do you start?
Well, you start by hiking, of course, and then probably a good place to go, I think, to sort of reach the next level. If you've hiked like a lot of the more difficult peaks in the east, like I think probably the most challenging and interesting peak from a mountaineering standard in the east is Katahdin in Maine. That's almost like a peak in Colorado, almost. The trails are rough and rugged, the terrain is steep, and once you've done that, probably a good place to go next is Colorado. Start trying to do some 14ers. That's very popular. They have trails. They're easy. The elevation, once you get acclimated, is usually not too much of a problem, and that will get you into sort of more challenging stuff, a little more scrambling, a little more off-trail travel. There are a few Colorado 14ers where it's almost like you're actually having to do some real climbing almost. And once you do those, there's so many ways you can go. A lot of people get into ski mountaineering in the winter. A lot of people enjoy going to glaciated mountains like Mount Hood or Mount Rainier in the Northwest, which are, you need to get your ice axe and crampons and stuff. People could do ice climbing. There's no end to what you do. The best, you can take classes, you can hire mountain guides, which is a good way to learn things. You can join clubs that have courses. I moved to Seattle about 30 years ago, and I joined the local club called the Mountaineers, which ran classes, and that's how I learned to do a lot of the more advanced skills, like using an ice axe and things like that. So yeah, there's all different ways to do it.
We don't need an ice axe much here in the southern Appalachians, just for the record.
Right.
If we see snow, we shut the whole region down and buy milk and eggs for some reason. Tell us about Peakbagger. I said at the beginning, and again, I'm not sponsored, but I'm telling you, I think it's the best website in the world for anything related to mountains anywhere in the world. Tell us, you started Peakbagger. Like, when did you start it? Why did you start it? And why should people who love hiking in the mountains, why they need to go to the website and download it?
Nobody needs to go to the website.
Oh, yes,
they need to go out and hike. That's what people need to do. But no, I started it out just as a database of peaks. I just wanted to have, because I was interested in these peak lists, and I just wanted to put these peak lists online, like the state high points or whatever, just whatever list, so that people could see what they were. When I started it back in the late 90s, there was no like Wikipedia or anything like that. There wasn't much on the internet. So I just said, people should know what these lists are. I should put them on the internet. And after a few years, I said, I've done a lot of hikes. Maybe I should put those on here too. And then I said, if I'm going to put my hikes there, maybe some other people might want to put their hikes on this site too. So that actually took a lot of time to say, okay, so I've got a list of climbers and a list of peaks. And then if people climb the peaks, they can sort of tag them on the site. And then we can see, And then you can sort of pay me, see, oh, and then I can see what peaks my friends have done and see what peaks I've done. And then if there's a peak I want to do, and I can look online and see, oh, my friend has not done that peak. Maybe he wants to do it with me. Because, Peakbaggers never climb the same peak twice. That's a general rule that I've seen that holds in a lot of cases. But so anyway, just kind of gradually took off from there. I mean, I guess it was the main launch of it was in 2004, which is almost over 20 years ago now. And it just gradually grew by word of mouth. And, now it's got a couple thousand users, registered users. They use the site. So, yeah, it's just kind of a gradual thing, I'd say.
Do you guys have merch on your website?
No,
I
we
meant to
don't.
ask you at the beginning. Oh, we need merch, man. We need some merch.
Yeah, I've thought about that, about getting mugs and T-shirts and stuff, but that'll maybe come in the future.
All right. I want to thank you so much, Greg, that you would take the time out of your day to just spend with our channel. I'm thankful. I'm very thankful. Be sure, for those of you who watch the live stream or watch when I use this in future videos, because that is one of the things I want to do is reference a lot of the things that Greg has shared in future videos, or even in future live streams, and go talk about this when issues of prominence comes up. You're talking, Greg, you're an expert in this. I consider you an expert anyway. And so it's been a pleasure for you to, we appreciate your contribution. I want to thank you guys. And that's it. That's it. We are out of here, and we will see you guys next time.
All right. It's been a pleasure, Bill. Thank you for inviting me. Absolutely.
Yes, sir. All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.